tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
The real substance of the announcement, which I was actually eager to talk to Justin Trudeau and his Liberal members of Parliament about, is housing. And I actually would have raised at this press conference, had I been allowed there, a question based on the report done by Professor Ross McKitrick, who we've had on the show before. He's an economics professor at the University of Guelph and also does great work with the Fraser Institute. He has come out with a new study called Wrong Move at the Wrong Time, talking about, in the midst of a housing crisis, why government regulations on energy efficiency are making the cost of homes much, much worse. Ross McKitrick joins me now. Always good to talk to you, Ross. Thanks for coming on today.
Hi, Andrew. My pleasure.
So let's first off talk about what it is you were setting out to analyze here, because we know that home values, just based on any number of criteria, are going up in cost. We know that people, especially young people, are being essentially priced out of the market here. You've touched on an aspect that I don't hear discussed in the housing context as much as it should be here.
What I'm looking at is a detail that's buried in the federal government's emission reduction plan, which was published last year. I got some attention. The plan got some attention at the time, but a little detail is buried in it, which is a requirement for new homes as of 2025 to be 61% more energy efficient, and by 2030, 65% more energy efficient. And commercial buildings have to be 59% more energy efficient. And I just couldn't believe that that is in the report. And that there was no discussion around it. Is it even possible? And this is more energy efficient compared to 2019. So if you looked at houses built in 1919, I don't think we're 65% more energy efficient than houses built in 1919, but maybe we could get there. But 2019, houses in Canada are already very energy efficient, where they're insulated, double glazed windows, all that stuff. So we're already very energy efficient. And they're now saying, basically, you have to build houses that don't use any energy. And how on earth people are supposed to heat their house and light their house and all the rest of it. So I did some looking into potential cost estimates here. I looked at information from the Canadian Home Builders Association. They put some numbers out. And my estimate is, and I think it's probably a bit optimistic, but it'll raise the cost of building a new home in Canada by about 8.3%. And so that, on a national average basis, is over $50,000 per house. And that in turn is going to have some negative economic impacts, reduce GDP, but it'll also really hit the construction industry hard. I think we'll see output and employment falling in the construction sector, which is the opposite of what we need. We need a lot more people working in the home building sector.
I think it's important to note for the audience, just to be absolutely clear, we're talking about new houses here. So
Yes.
That is particularly interesting when I look at, in a new house, if you're going to make something even more energy efficient, like, are we talking about a different grade of windows? Are we talking about a different grade of insulation? I mean, where is that money going to meet this very aggressive efficiency target?
Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of people who are real advocates for an aggressive energy efficiency agenda, they always assume that no matter how rigid you set these targets, people always benefit from them because you save money on the energy down the road. People already have the option of increasing the energy efficiency of their homes, and people do, but only up to a point. After that, it's not worth it. You don't really get the payoff from it, or you might just rather spend your money on something else. This kind of regulation, it's going to, if it's even possible, and there's nothing in there about how this could even be done, but if it's possible to build new homes that are 65% more energy efficient than they were in 2019, it means you have to throw a lot of money at this one aspect of a house. And people, it's a waste of money for most people. I should add one other thing, and that is right now it's on new houses. But there is discussion in the building codes circle about adding these requirements on existing houses. So anytime you go to do a renovation now, you may be required, if the new rules come in, you may be required to hit even more ambitious targets. So just because you own a house now doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be safe from this crazy agenda.
Is that a wood stove I see in the background on yours? Because I mean that's very energy efficient, but that raises other issues from the government. So I mean that's
That
the
it's
irony
a
here is
natural
that
gas
if people
powered.
are using these alternative sources, that makes other problems. The regulators would say.
That's a natural gas powered stove, and those are in the crosshairs of regulators as well. Um, I think you may have to have a wood stove in your house because I don't know how else you're going to heat it
Hmm.
if these rules come through. But in the case you mentioned that you hadn't heard any discussion of this aspect of the issue, and I agree. This is it's there in the report. It's not prominent, but it's such a crazy number, like a 65% improvement in energy efficiency with no guidance about how that's going to happen and no calculation of how much it will cost or whether it's worth it. To put it in perspective, the it doesn't reduce greenhouse gas emissions very much, but per ton of emission reductions, it's 50 times more expensive than the carbon tax. So if you think the carbon tax is taking a chunk out of people's living standards, this kind of regulation is even more expensive. It really accomplishes very little, and it does so at an incredibly high cost.
Well, and I would also point out here, and you have a section in the report that talks about deadweight losses, and which is, to say when firms are essentially passing on to consumers these increase in construction costs. And the one thing here is that if we're baking this in, it's not even where a lot of consumers have the option to do this. Because a lot of the energy efficiency proposals that we've seen in the past, you could make some sort of a business case for it. Admittedly, often those rely on tax credits and subsidies, but if something's going to save you money, you'll do it. At this point, we're talking about installations in homes that go well above what you could ever hope to gain from these efficiencies, supposedly.
Yeah, there's a large literature in the economics field looking at these kinds of energy efficiency regulations. And in economics, people have tended to be fairly pessimistic that these are worth it, that governments typically way overestimate the value of these energy efficiency mandates. But when people have gone afterwards and looked at, okay, how much did this house actually save from having to redo all its windows? The answer is it's a negative rate of return. Oftentimes, people never recover the upfront investment, which means the homeowners were justified in not doing it voluntarily. So then, if you force them to do it, you haven't made them better off, you make them worse off. And in this case, I think we can guarantee 100% this kind of regulation will make people much worse off. And it's there in the title of the report, wrong move, but it's also at the wrong time. I mean, of all the terrible times to add 8% to the cost of building a home, now when we already have a crisis of affordability in housing, it's absolutely baffling to me.
Now, looking at the regional breakdown here, you say it's a national average of just shy of 55,000. In BC, 78,000 is the average cost increase. In Ontario, where you and I are, 71,800. On the low end, you've got New Brunswick, 22,000, Newfoundland, 22,000. Is that disparity just because of kind of the general average cost of homes, or are there other regional specific factors that are making things a little bit less aggressive in the prairies in Atlantic Canada here and more in BC and Ontario?
So that particular calculation is just based on the regional variation in the cost of building homes, the estimated cost of building homes. There are also regional disparities in terms of the macroeconomic impact. But in the case of Ontario and BC, just because of the way the market's gone, this is the most expensive place to build new homes. And so that's why, since it's a cost percentage estimate, that's why that number comes out over 70,000 here, and in other places it's under 25,000.
What we hear, I mean, even about, I don't know, when was it, 30 minutes ago, Justin Trudeau in London, Ontario, speaking about housing, uses the line, which is not entirely inaccurate, which is that there is not just one lever that government can pull that's going to solve the housing crisis. But I'm struck by what you pointed out about how wildly disproportionate this increase in cost is compared to even the carbon tax alone. If you were to pull one, this would be a pretty good one to pull.
Well, I think if they were serious about wanting to get the cost of housing down, what they should do is say, forget that part of the emission reduction plan. Like, just scratch it out. We're not going to go ahead with it. And the other rumored changes to building codes on the energy efficiency front, they're all on pause. That's easy. It's no cost to them. Doesn't really have any emission consequences, but it does mean that those cost increases won't happen. The fact that this government is not able to walk away from any of its climate policies because that's their top priority, I think gives you an idea more generally of whether they're going to be successful in addressing the housing crisis generally. I just don't think it's yet a priority for them.
When you mentioned in the report as well, as sort of a hint at perhaps some future research you might do on this, or something that might be taken up elsewhere, that it furthers that disparity in generation as well, because the older generation, they already have their homes, they've not required necessarily a new home, and that's not to say they won't buy a new home, but younger people that are entering the housing market that have to wait for new homes to be built to enter and to have a house, they're the ones that bear this burden. So it really furthers what has already been a pretty significant and I'd say very relevant gap in just, I don't like using the word equity because of the political implications of it, but basically in the access to the housing market, I'll say.
Yeah, there are some disturbing distributional aspects to this kind of policy, because you're right. I mean, someone like me, I own my home, and so I'm not really affected by this unless I hope to sell this and buy a new build. But this just adds to the burden of the younger generation, and also to the families who are trying to support them in that first home purchase. And it also negatively affects people working in the construction sector. But I do think there's a distributional aspect to this, which is really disturbing, just that it's at people at the lower end of their income earning stage, and people who are currently out of the housing market that want to get in, and they're the ones that will be most negatively affected.
The one thing about the carbon tax is you can sort of draw a line and say where that money is going and who benefits from it. And I'm curious with this, who's benefiting from this? I mean, all this money that's being spent on these houses, is it people that are in the green energy sector that are making the money off this?
Yep. It's the people that have home energy efficiency gadgets for sale, because they're in a position now where they sell lots of stuff, but they don't sell everything they like to sell, because customers look at it and say, well, that costs way too much and I'm not interested in buying it. I'd rather spend my money on something else. Thank you very much. And now the government's going to say you have to buy it. So people in that sector will benefit, because all of a sudden they have a captive market and people have no choice. They have to spend the money on whether it's insulation or heat pumps or window systems, lighting systems. You have to buy certain types now that you might have preferred not to buy. So that group benefits. Everybody else loses.
I've never built a new house before, but I've done renovations and fixed things, and there's nothing more infuriating than needing to spend money on something that you don't want but you need, that will derive value. It's like replacing a deck or replacing a concrete slab, because it's like the money you're going to invest in your house, I'd love to invest in expanding the kitchen, building an addition, putting in something that I like. And that's the problem here, is that these are either going to completely price people out of having a new home altogether, or that $50,000 national average that they have to spend on these energy things is going to come at the expense of square footage, say, that they might have wanted or needed.
Sure, yeah. It might be an extra bedroom that you needed that you can't have, or it can be an upgrade to the kitchen. Again, it's the issue is people have their own preferences of what they want to spend their money on, and some of that includes energy efficiency and the comfort of having a home that's not drafty and that sort of thing. So they already spend money on that. But everybody's got a certain point where they say, okay, that's enough of that, but I also want a pool in the backyard. And this is taking away all those options. That it's forcing people to spend a great deal of money on one particular thing that is way past the point of marginal benefit for people.
Professor Ross McKitrick, the report is called Wrong Move at the Wrong Time, Economic Impacts of the New Federal Building Energy Efficiency Mandates. That came out this week from the Fraser Institute. Ross, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Andrew. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.